Mhm. Tosh, can you feed the dogs? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Fellow pharmacognosys. Any questions before we get started on the monologue? Today, today I'm supposed to be talking about inflammation, something I'm intimately familiar with, as my entire life is a battle against the constant desire for my knee to swell up into an unpleasant mass of swollen flesh. I was just reflecting the other day upon the time in 2009 after getting a MRI. It was revealed that I had an osteochondral lesion on the lateral femoral condyle. This means I have a hole in the bone of my knee. And that was 16 years ago. Um, and so yeah, I've learned a lot about treating swelling, particularly due to degenerative joint diseases. Um, but that's only a partial manifestation of inflammation. There's inflammation of all sorts. Inflammation associated with cancer, inflammation driven by metabolic causes, inflammation from infection, inflammation from any various external injuries, inflammation induced by stress, uh, inflammation, kind of common currency of so many of the conditions that we see in the clinic. There's also all the complications of inflammation too, where it is a double-edged sword. There is physiological inflammation, like our gut lining is inflamed all the time, and it's totally normal to some degree, right? It's always like, yeah, the dosage, the medicine, the difference between the medicine and the poison is in the dosage. The difference in the physiological nature of inflammation is in its dosage too, to some degree. Part of inflammation is the wound healing process, and an interesting statement about cancer is that cancer is like a wound that never heals. And when you turn on all of these mechanisms for wound healing and you never turn them off, you end up driving constant proliferation of tissue, which ends up creating masses and tumors and turning malignant and becoming cancer. On the other hand, in the intestinal lining, there is something similar happening with when inflammation occurs. There's also the recruitment of the immune system, immune actors, that are involved in surveillance and determination of self and non-self and good and bad. And this is what's happening at the intestinal lining as we're constantly confronted by various oddities that are entering into our body through the oral cavity. Um, and some of them we want to absorb into our bloodstream, some of them we don't. Some are nutrients, some are pathogens. And so this physiological inflammation in the gut lining is necessary in order to facilitate this observation of the immune system of that which is being absorbed through the intestinal lining. Of course, beyond a certain degree, then it becomes inflammatory bowel condition and ends up impacting absorption and transit time and all of these issues, which then leads to pathology in the intestinal system. And so inflammation is a very interesting thing because it has to be so um, closely modulated in order to be effective without being harmful. In that sense, it's just like fire, right? That was cool. I thought that was a cool conclusion. I was like, wait, it's just like fire, actually, Like fire is great until, you're like, oh, dude, it's all about the mayhem is about to begin. It's like summertime, it's getting hot, fire season's gonna come. There's a bunch of donkeys that are gonna go out in the forest and try to light, they're not gonna try to light forest fires. They're gonna try to light campfires to like, make some tea or burn some food and burn some food, cook some whatever. But somebody's gonna try to light a little fire, campfire, and it's gonna turn into a forest fire. Of course, last year we had the line fire. It was just an insane guy that decided to, start fires for the sake of starting fires, which is, so we're all like waiting with bated breath, um, to see that he's convicted of maximum penalties, hopefully drawn and quartered. Um, okay, don't mind me. I was traumatized every year. I'm traumatized by eviction, by not eviction notices. No, no, evacuation orders. Not pleasant, when you're like trying to when you realize when you have to make decisions about what is meaningful to you and what is not, and what you're going to um, save from the fire and what you're going to let be. It's very liberating, actually. You're like, no, I'm fine. I can live with the loss of everything. Okay, so this lecture we'll start with Huang Lian and we'll end with Huang Lian. Um, because whatever, there's other stories. I mean, okay. Um, Now we have this part two monograph, right? So I figured that we should introduce part two monograph and some of try to mitigate the potential horrors of that exercise. Um, and so I just uploaded today's notes like 10 minutes ago, maybe 18 now that we're 8 minutes into this class. Um, and um, and so like page 52 of those notes, I'm gonna start introducing some of the like how to navigate through this terrain in a way that can minimize the amount of time you have to invest in this process. So let's look at that. That's a cute little sound. How to monograph part two. Okay. The outline is this is the outline. It's sort of like, you have more flexibility, to I guess maybe the last point in the entire like slide deck or in that monograph is essentially you just get points for making good points, like you can if I looked at this section and it's like what are the molecular signaling pathways that each of the active constituents in this plant are active in. If you just want to go to town on molecular signaling pathways and like, if I'm looking at this is the Coptis example, so Coptis, the major active constituents are isoquinoline alkaloids, berberine, protoberberine, palmitine, zeterazine, and on, many other iso-oxy protoberberines and oxyberberines and um so I could just look up all of just spend all my time looking at, MAP kinase and NF kappa beta and PDL1 pathway and IL-6 pathways and PI3K, AKT-mTOR pathways and looking at different active constituents, and just spend some time working through that. This relates back to, section seven, which was like, what are the marker compounds? And then in section seven, we asked, what's the general chemistry of this plant? Like, what category do the active constituents fall in? Because in some cases, the marker compounds are not really reflective of what are the active constituents. The marker compounds are chosen for somewhat opaque reasons. The active constituents are, chosen specifically because they're involved in the major therapeutic benefit of the plant. So when we're studying the pharmacology of the plant, we need to look specifically at the active constituents. So then we move into this domain with that knowledge. We know what the active constituents are. And so this is the expanded view rather than thinking about like a single marker compound or a single compound. When the plant is active pharmacologically, it's active through the combined effect of some large spectrum of compounds, like more than five for sure. I mean, God knows the number is likely virtually infinite. Like at some point, it's like everything in the plant is doing something. So you kind of focus on the major actors, which is like a handful. Um, and depending upon your plant, like you could explain the function of Huang Lian pretty much just by talking about berberine. Ginseng, you can talk about ginsennosoids, you can talk about a few different classes of ginsennosoids. Um, Something like Bansha would be more complex. There's a few different elements. There's isoflavonoids, there's certain proteins that are important. It's a little bit there's actually, I think, some alkaloids as well. Something like Ma Huang is pretty much just an out. You're just talking about ephedrine. Depending upon your plant, it may be worthwhile to look at more than one molecule. Um, and it's it's like not novel. Like this stuff has been done a lot, quite a bit, right? And so the way to start getting into this, like, you're like, where do I begin? Oh my God. Because if you do what I did, you just go on PubMed and you start like, you just endless process. People have asked these exact questions before. This is not novel. The first thing that you should do is look for monographs that have already been done. The World Health Organization has a bunch of monographs. They have their World Health Organization monographs. This is not, somebody did their part one primarily using the World Health Organization monograph. If we go to topics in the Blackboard where we have the monograph assignment topics, and that's like the third topic that we run into in the topics section. Excuse me for making motorcycle noises. Um, if we go to Blackboard and we go to topics section, assignment, no topics. Doing topics now. Blackbot is like having a day. Blackbot's having a day. Blackbot like wouldn't let me upload stuff for okay, so if we go to topics and we go to monograph assignment, you go to monograph assignment and scroll down and down and down and so one of the things, the first thing that you run into that's like a downloadable thing is the ginkgo leaf monograph. The ginkgo leaf monograph is an American herbal pharmacopoeia monograph. This is exhaustive and covers a lot of what was in part one and also what is coming up in part two. An assessment of the active constituents and what their function is, and then a look at those active constituents after we skip through all the analytical stuff. We get into the therapeutics, clinical efficacy, and pharmacodynamics. And then, yeah. So, uh, the monographs that I mentioned in this week's PowerPoint or PDF, one is the World Health Organization monograph. So if we scroll further down, we have the World Health Organization monograph for Artemisia annua. So if you go to either one of those websites, the AHP monographs websites or the World Health Organization monographs, you might find your plant, You might not find your plant. This is like the initial due diligence, right? Like I should look for my plant. I should look to see if there's a World Health Organization monograph for my plant. I should look to see if there's a AHP monograph. It's likely that the AHP monograph is not free, so you might choose to not purchase it if it exists because it's $40. You might engage in, you know, online piracy, I guess is one way of describing it, where you start searching to see if there's like a copy of the AHP monograph floating around somewhere. Um, the World Health Organization monographs are all free. The list is more extensive than the AHP monographs. The AHP monographs are really good though. Um, Very helpful. Um, Beyond that, there's the ZYSJ monograph. So if you go to that link, you have all of that stuff. A lot of people utilize that in part one to great effect, the ZYSJ monographs. Beyond that, then you can go into PubMed and you can start searching for stuff, and journals that have a lot of information that's relevant to what we're doing is the Journal of Ethnopharmacology and Frontiers in Pharmacology. And frequently, one of those journals will have these massive reviews that are essentially monographs where they will cover like the ethnobotany, the pharmacology, the traditional uses of some plant. And so you can just search PubMed for your plant. I say other genera, that means Coptis or whatever the genus of your plant is. It's not so functional to search Huang Liang, like you'll probably find something, but it's typically you find more information when you search for the genus and species, Coptis chinensis or just Coptis, and then some of those terms like ethnobotany or pharmacology or whatever. And then you might also want to move into searching for active constituents. And then we get into clinical trials. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov and search for your particular plant name. Um, you can search on PubMed and then change the setting to clinical trial. This rabbit hole question is just, after you've done all that assessment of looking at the monographs that are available and going through some of these reviews on PubMed, you'll probably have something will stick out. You'll be like, oh, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I love about this plant, and this is the science that's explaining my love for it. And let's talk. That can just be what you do. I mean, that's the goal. The rubric provides a like a militant outline for that's just like the bare minimum, like the brute method, where it's like, if you have no perspective and don't really care and just want to like just do it A, B, C, X, Y, Z, then, but um, the other side of that is just get 10 and just do like 10 important points in the section that's worth 10 points, and it doesn't have to be like answer every question. It's just like, invest time in that section. Toxicology is look, and then so a lot of the toxicology stuff will be in like in the monographs. There's a toxicology section. Typically, when you're reviewing the pharmacology of a plant, it will review the toxicology. You could go on Memorial Sloan Kettering site and look for drug interactions. You can go on Medline Plus drugs info site and look for drug interactions. You can search for drug interactions various different ways. Um, and then the review of the TCM usage is again like just look in the pharmacopoeias. Like you can look in Bensky at that point. You can look in CYSJ is the best source because CYSJ has all of the like the Zhonghua Bensao has all of the early Bensao's like little short entries from Sheneng Bensao Jing, from Bensao Gongmu, from Ruhuazi Bensao, and from the Bensao Zhongshan, and all these old cool old Bensao. They have entries from them at CYSJ. Um, and then it's like make a formula family tree. Formula family trees are like the best way to understand your herb. It's a really cool process that doesn't need to be too involved, but it can be really awesome, like where if you make one for Huang Lian and you understand the combinations, of like Huang, one section on the bottom is these formulas where Huang Lian is combined with Huang Qin, um, and or Huang Lian and Huang Bai for Bai To Wang for diarrhea, for dysentery. Looking like adjacency, Huanglian going to Dahuang, Huanglian, Sheishentong, Dahuang, Huanglian, Dahuang, Huanglian, Sheishentong is Dahuang and Huanglian. Sheishentong is Dahuang, Huanglian, and Huangchen. Fuzi Sheishentong is Fuzi, Dahuang, Huanglian, and Huangchen. And so you like build out from the central nucleus according to like how similar they are. Like if you were working with Baishao, you would go Baishao to Xiaoyao Gansao Tong. You start with the herb and then you move to Xiaoyao Gansao Tong, which is Baishao and Gansao. And then you would go to Sini San, because then the next is a four herb formula called Sini Tan, which is Sini San, which is Zhisher, Baishao, Gansao, Chaihu. And then from Sini San, from either one of those, I could then go to Zhisher Xiaoyao San, which is just Zhisher, Baishao, another two herb formula. And then you can go to like Guizhou Tong, which is a five herb formula with Guizhou, Baishao, Shengjiang, Dazhao, Zhigansao. So you start building from the single herb to the first formula, which is probably two or three or four herbs, to then building around what is most similar. These can also be separated out like functionally, where like a Jisher Baishao tends towards diarrhea formulas, like or tends towards constipation formulas or formulas that induce diarrhea at high concentration, which would be Jisher and Baishao combination going into Da Chai Hu Tong or Mazi Renwan. Or I think Popo San. song, maybe Hopo Sangwutang, maybe not. So studying how to make herb, like a really good way to learn about herbal formula families are Huang Huang's books. Huang Huang has the book 50 Medicinals, which in the Tenki formula families, like I mean, if you're using one of the one of the herbs in the Tenki formula families, like Guager and Chaihu, and I'm not sure what else is in that book.
Can
Um,
can you spell that author's name or put it in the chat?
it's there in the lecture notes.
Oh, oh,
Huang,
sorry.
yellow. I'm sorry.
I was trying to look up the tree that you had listed that from the Institute of Classics and East Asian Medicine. So I was off the page for a second. Sorry.
No worries. And then that's what's next too, like is Arnaud's thing. So I'm giving props to Arnaud actually, because that I stole a slide from his lecture. That's the slide from the Huang Huang. Ooh, that's the slide. That's the one of the picture. That's from the PDF from the Huang Lian lecture. Arnaud's thing is like a whole massive course, right? So it's like I don't even know if you can buy that lecture individually. It's there. It's like $500 or something. You know, so he's keeping up with inflation, to say the least. But I mean, this maybe before Arnaud, Huang Huang was offering something similar. Um, and then it's always a subset, right? And so I want to do like they don't do a Huang Qi formula family. I don't think either one of them does a Huang Qi formula family. And so I've actually been working on that because I will be talking about I was planning on doing Huang Qi. I think I've changed my mind anyway. So maybe I won't be doing that. But like depending upon what herb you are doing, there might not be like ready-made formula families for you. Like Aiden's doing Ji Shui Sao. Like nobody's done a Ji Shui Sao herbal formula family. Um,
Yeah, it's
these
almost
guys,
impossible to find a family tree for that.
yeah. And so you essentially then have to then look up every formula that was in that has Ji Shui Sao in it, which is going to be somewhat challenging because there's no like classical formulas with Ji Shui Sao that come to mind. So you typically would have to go to CYSJ and then look for the formulas that have Ji Shui. Have you found formulas that have Ji Shui Sao in it?
I mean, there are, but it's never a primary herb like Wang Liang.
Right. Yeah. There's no Ji Shui Sao Tong. Um,
No.
yeah. And so that's the game. So then you collect all those formulas and then you start looking for and so if we do this thing, so let's finish up this thing and we'll kind of go back to that idea because I think many people have this issue. So then there's these other two websites, Me and Chi and Sacred Lotus. So Me and Chi, if you look up your herb on Me and Chi, if you look up Huang Lian, then you find then it has a bunch of formulas that have Huang Lian in it. Probably not all of them, but quite a few. And then if you take those formulas and you go into Sacred Lotus, you get this archetypes thing, which is really cool. So let's look at that. So let's go to the playthrough of a lot of this stuff that I just talked about. Um, okay. All right. That was like, I don't know what happened. I don't know why my audio went off. I was like asking questions and nobody's faces were moving, and it was like a weird experience of some one of the rings of Dante's hell, apparently. Um, so am I full screen in Google search engine now?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the World Health Organization monograph website where you have like the volume 1 and 2. It covers probably 100 different herbs. If you're lucky, you'll be in there. This is the Coptis monograph from World Health Organization's website. And so it goes into the pharmacology, and then it'll have like the citations. So theoretically, you know, it would be more, you would score more brownie points if you went to the original sources, but you could probably just cite the World Health Organization monograph. The toxicology, there's some discussion of adverse reactions here, but I see the whatever the term I'm looking for, the toxicology stuff is usually more detailed at other, the IC50. Herbal monograph, American Pharmacopoeia, like they didn't have Wonglion, they don't have Coptis chinensis, but Hydrastis canadensis is a berberine containing plant. So if you know, that's kind of neither here nor there, but it's close, you know. And then there's ZYSJ. This is ZYSJ translated into English, you know, like I just used Google to translate it into English, and suddenly I have all of the English stuff. And so the first pharmacopoeia is a Chinese pharmacopoeia, fairly vanilla. If we go further down, we have the Chinese dictionary, which has more information. I mean, everything from part 1 is, you know, like, and it was essentially here. And then we get to like in this, if we have pharmacological action. So we have all this information about the different effects on the circulatory system, effects on acetylcholine, effects on bile secretion and blood. You know, this is like the low-hanging bar of assessing this information. And then we have commentary from early pharmacopoeias, you know, like if we want to assess what it says about Huanglian in the Bensao Jing. In the Shanong Bensao Jing, it was used to treat eye pain caused by heat, tears from canthus injury. I mean, these are not the ideal translations, but, you know, they'll do. Compendium of Materia Medica is the Bensao Gongmu, the Bielu is the Mingyi Bielu, the Mingyi Bielu is a pharmacopoeia written by Tao Hongjing. The Mingyi Bielu is actually where we find our Shenong Bensao Jing. There's no original copy of the Shenong Bensao Jing. The Shenong Bensao Jing appears as like part of the Mingyi Bielu, like a commentary from famous doctors. You know, so if you want to talk about what it says in early pharmacopoeias, like this is a good start, talking about the Shenong Bensao Jing, about the Bensao Gongmu. And you can look up each of these things individually, you know, and find more about that information. And you know, and then I can go on to what is in PubMed, and we have these like, comprehensive review of traditional uses, botany, phytochemistry, pharmacology, toxicology. And you go down in there and you get to pharmacology, and then you get all the different mechanisms, all the things that have been studied, antibiotic function and or antibacterial, antiviral effect, and you know, antibiotic function, and then metabolic function for obesity and diabetes and atherosclerosis and so on and so forth. Pharmacokinetics, toxicology, the LD50. Okay, the lethal dose amongst 50% of the tested population. Then we have these, you can get this information on lethal dose, like some herbs may be challenging to find an LD50 on like tonic herbs, but I imagine you probably could because people are sadistic and they like killing things for some reason. And so, you know, if you feed a mouse like, you know, 800 grams per kilogram of some herb, they're likely going to die from it, no matter how beneficial it is, you know. You can always find a way, you know, people always find a way. Then you know, and then I can search for active constituents and find things like this. You know, jatarazine is one of the major alkaloids from Coptis chinensis. Then we have all this same stuff: pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, toxicology. There's a question about clinical trials. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov. I can find clinical trials. If I click on the ones that are completed, I should be able to find some mention of how to get to the published trial. Yeah, and
Dr. Ross, I have a question on ZYSJ. You mentioned that it would reference the earliest sighting that of an herb, and I'm just wondering, how do you is there a specific place that's seen, or do you just know that because you know the order of all of the classical texts and which was published in which order?
yeah, kind of part two. Um, so if I look at this, hmm, it's in English, it's insanity. The Dictionary of Chinese Medicine. So if we go through like the pharmacopoeia, like Chinese pharmacopoeia is the first entry, Chinese pharmacopoeia. And it doesn't say, right? It doesn't say what the source is. And then when we get to dictionary, Zhongyao Da CDN, we have source, and it says the original sutra, you know. That's the Shenang Bensao Jing. Like that's what they translated that into. I like I know some English and some Chinese and some and also like what Chinese gets translated into by a bad translation. So if we go back to the Chinese, then you see it says Benjing. And the Benjing is the abbreviation for the Shenang Bensao Jing. Other herbs, like I guess we could, oh man, I don't really want to do this, but let Aiden, what's the original appearance of Ji Shui Sao?
They it does seem like it was the
Oh yeah, we
Ben
already went over this. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, okay, what's a more obscure herb that probably isn't in either one? Does anybody have any comments like herbs that somebody chose that wasn't in the Shenong Ben Sao Jing? Like Jiao Gulan. What is Jiao Gulan? Gynostema pentaphyllum. Gynostema pentaphyllum. I'm like, you better not be in the in the Shenong Ben Sao Jing. Um, and over my head. Like it doesn't have the Zhongyao Da CDN doesn't give the original source for it. Actually, here Zhongyao Da no. Yeah, that might be. Then I might have to play that game of like going down to looking for um well, I mean, Cynthia, you're fortunate, I think, because Huang Shi's first appearance is in the Shenong Ben Jing, isn't it? I don't know. Does anybody have any particular herb that like they need that question answered for? This would be hopefully easier to answer, but I'm assuming it is, but its entry kind of sucks. Like, why does it? um, it doesn't have any of that information here at this time. Well, I mean, my solution to that question is to just just look it up in Chinese and to yeah, there's Huang Qi's entries in the Shenong Bensao Jing. So Huang Qi first appears in the Shenong Bensao Jing. I wonder if the problem is searching for Huang Qi, because I imagine like in Shenong Bensao Jing it might have been called something else. It's either the wrong term, the wrong characters, or it's the wrong anyway. Well, we know where that appeared, so sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. That's all kind of confusing actually, because like the Huangqi entry doesn't say, but the Jishui Sao entry does say, the Huanglian entry did say. So there's sometimes you run into inconsistencies. Um, Clinical trial stuff, drug interaction stuff, MSK or Medline Plus, and then formula family stuff. Like I just searched like Huanglian formula family, and I got like, and I used the .pdf ending to find some lecture notes from Huang, which is like a tease, but it's like half of the lecture, because there's like 12 herbs with Huang Lian in the Shanghan Zabing Lun, and so there's like whatever, like 6 listed there. Um, there is that link to the formula family lecture in our no, and here's the Mian Chi website. And if you put Huanglian and Mian Qi, then you get all these formulas Huanglian's used in Qingwei San, Bancha Shan Tang, Jiao Taiwan. And then you can go to 28 more formulas. And and so then I can look up, I can whatever, I mean, if you want to be super into that, you can make a list of all the herbs and then start looking for, like, choose the ones that are Huanglian, Huangqin, Gansao, and then you have all the Shan Tongs, Bancha Shan Tong and Shengzhang Shan Tong and Gansao Shan Tong, and you start getting little groupings going. And the other way to do that is here at Sacred Lotus. Sacred Lotus, you can formula archetypes. So if I look up Huang Lian and or some herb in Sacred Lotus. Oops, that was wrong. I didn't. They heard me talking about inflammation, and I'm already getting ads for inflammation. If I go to Huang Lian, then I get a list of all the formulas that it appears in, another list of formulas. So I could use Shan Tong as my archetype, because it's like quite small, because it's Da Huang, Huang Lian, and Huang Chen. And then I can go to formula archetypes, and then it'll give me these matchings where it's like, oh, like Xiaoyao Tong has 3 herbs in common, because Xiaoyao Tong has Da Huang, Huang Lian, Huang Chen in it. And then Shan Tong was the archetype, and then Puji Xiao Du Yin will have whatever Huang Lian and Huang Chen. Da Huang has Huang Lian and Da Huang. Actually, that's wrong. It has Huang Chen and Da Huang. So just, Gugan Shin Lian Tong is another similar, because it has Huang Lian and Huang Chen. Mushang Bing Long Wan has, I don't know what. Has Da Huang, has Huang Lian. So ways to try to find some guidance to see similar formulas. Okay.
Dr. Ross, can you walk through that again? Because I'm trying to do
Nope.
Huangzi on the Sacred Lotus site right now. So where do we put in the herb? Oh, okay.
Um,
Because I was using that live search at the side and it was not getting
oh, I mean, I don't know if, I mean, let's see what happens when I use the search bar I just used.
totally different. Well,
Well, because it gives you this weirdness, right? And then you have to like actually navigate back to into the actual website because the first four are like sponsored links, right? And so link 5 brings you back into Sacred Lotus. This is what you have to do to like not to keep your
okay.
website active when you don't want to pay for it, you know? Janky website, but thank God it exists, you know? And so yeah, then we get to Huang Chi and then we get to all these Huang Chi formulas. I mean,
Okay.
I wonder if me and Chi has a bigger list. Like, I mean, that's a pretty decent starting point, you know? Then if you did that over here and me and Chi, then you could do, um, oops, I'm still in
I'm not
another
sure why, but
language.
PhD has been down for me, and somebody else and a couple other people mentioned that it's not working for them either right now.
All right. Well, I don't, then maybe not. Well, that's okay. Well, thank you, Sacred Lotus, then. Sacred Lotus is a functional alternative. I mean, there's also those others, those textbooks, you know, there's also textbooks. There's also TCM Clinic Aid too, you know, TCM Clinic Aid, I think is that I have this app on my phone called TCM Clinic Aid, which is quite helpful if you go to Materia Medica, individual herb, Huang Chi, I look up Huang Chi and then it lists at the bottom it lists a massive, much larger set of formulas than Sacred Lotus lists, starting with I Fu Nuan Gong Wan and On Chong Tong and On Tai Yin and TCM Clinic Aid, if anybody is not familiar with that, is pretty darn good. Um, yeah. Okay, that's enough of that
Do you prefer
stuff.
TCM Clinicaid over the Ben Sao app?
I don't know. I don't think I have a way of making any statement. I don't think I have the Ben Sal app. I
I
just have
use
TCM
both of
Clinic.
them.
You use both of them?
Yeah.
Is that Hunter?
Hunter, yeah.
Do you have, I haven't used TCM Clinicaid in years. I was just wondering like what you would use for what.
I use the TCM Clinic Aid a lot of times for ear points, at least from what I remember, like in the clinic and the extra points. So I
Okay.
usually use the TCM Clinic Aid, but I use both of them for herbs because they have different things listed in both of them. Like that's where I got that section from for my monograph.
Aha. Thank you.
Formulas?
Yep. I
Okay.
looked through and wrote down every formula in both of those apps and then started deconstructing them. That's as far as I got. I go down too many rabbit holes.
Yeah, that's good. That's the game. I mean, it's just about going down rabbit holes. As much as teaching these lectures is beneficial, I just think doing the rabbit hole spelunking is the most beneficial part, you know? Um, yeah. So, okay, let's go and try to do a lecture now. Um, okay. Am I sharing my screen? Is it shared? Yes, okay. Pharmacognosy, week 7, inflammation. Is that week 7? Okay. You know, complex responsive living, vascularized tissue to injury. The cardinal signs are redness and swelling and pain and heat. It prevents the spread of damaging agents to nearby tissues, disposes of cell debris, and initiates the tissue repair. It's always an interesting thing. I remember pissing off students, you know, because that happens apparently. Um, talking about TGF beta and VEGF, and I mentioned that I've probably mentioned those things. So I'm always talking about cancer, and in cancer, it's bad. Like you need like this is a double-edged sword. As part of the inflammatory cascade, you will induce TGF beta and VEGF beta, um, or VEGF. You'll induce transforming growth factor, the tissue transforming growth factor, and the vascular endothelial growth factor in order to um, revascularize the damaged tissue and to regrow new tissue. You will in wound healing, that's totally appropriate. That's what happens when you initiate tissue repair. You need to upregulate transforming growth factor, which allows for all of the different tissues to transform into the appropriate types. And part of that is the vascularization. So in conjunction with TGF beta, you get induction of vascular endothelial growth factor. And ideally, when the tissue was repaired, those signaling cascades would be turned off. If they don't get turned off, then you just have endless transformation and endless vascularization, which leads to tumor formation. And so that's how these things are context dependent, right? If you're talking about TGF beta and vascular endothelial growth factor, and you're talking about it in the context of wound repair, it's good. If you're talking about it in cancer, it's a target for therapy. It's something that you want to turn off. And this also points to the double-edged sword of inflammation, because in cancer, in the syndrome of cancer, inflammation promotes cancer. When you have a wound, inflammation promotes wound healing. When you have a wound that doesn't heal and the inflammation doesn't stop, then you might end up getting cancer. And this is how we have these pro-inflammatory conditions that lead to massively increased risk of cancer. Inflammation is initiated by the release of chemical mediators into the extracellular fluid. The source of these mediators include injured tissue cells, phagocytes, lymphocytes, mast cells, and blood proteins. The most important inflammatory molecules are the histamines, the kinins, the prostaglandins, the complement system, and the lymphokines. They're all vasodilators. They promote blood flow. The blood flow that they induce vasodilation to increase blood flow to the area. This causes local congestion in the area. This accounts for the redness and the heat because of the increased blood accumulation in the area. Um, Increases in capillary permeability. So there is an increase in exudate that contains the proteins, such as the clotting factors and the antibodies. They seep from the bloodstream and into the interstitial fluid. This causes local edema, which in turn presses on adjacent nerve endings, causing pain. This is points to some of these ideas about Wei Qi. And what is Wei Qi? If you think about Wei Qi being the immune system, typically for the immune system, frequently this process of inflammation leading to the delivery of certain proteins and antibodies to into the interstitial fluid is part and parcel of the immune response, where there is vasodilation. Vasodilation is the blood vessels getting bigger. They dilate, and when they dilate, they stretch, and that causes permeability, like the cells, like little gaps in the cells appear in the tissue, so that then molecules can move out. And so this is how it's like the big freeway for the immune system is the vascular system, the blood vessels. But then when they get to their target, they need to exit the blood vessels to get to their target tissue and the interstitial fluid, somewhere in the extracellular matrix, somewhere outside of the vascular system. And if there is, without proper vasodilation, there's no delivery of the immune system to the proper target tissue. And so necessarily Wei Qi, the concept of Wei Qi is bigger than just molecules, because proper function of Wei Qi requires proper induction of vascular permeability at the target site. And this vasodilation requires nitric oxide production and release locally, and this kind of coordination with the histamines and all of these other things like the prostaglandins and the bradykinins and so on and so forth. So then, like everything else, it becomes this massively complex system of call and response in order to induce an effect, which is the combined effect of some material things and some functional things, the combined effect of structure and function together. And so we can make things very material and say that Wei Qi is the immune system, but Wei Qi, the concept of Qi in Chinese medicine is not purely material. It's also functional, and to some degree, almost entirely functional. If you look at the character, it's like the steam wafting off of rice as it's cooked, you know? That in itself is speaking of this transformation, the unlocking of the essence of something. It's a transformation that occurs through the application of heat, which is very similar to the transformation in some sense. I'm like, I don't know if this is really similar, but you know, in the inflammatory response where we have heat, heat can also induce vasodilation, and we have this transformation of the entire inflammatory and immune milieu of something, and it's the functional aspect is totally required for any of the structural elements to have any effect. So all these things are always working in conjunction with each other. It's important to not be excessively materialistic. It's important to but it's also important to not ignore the material components. And so if we have problems with inflammation or with the immune system, it's important to try to think about both sides. The element of the inflammatory cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines, are the actual cells of the immune system, but then also the regulation of the apparatus, which is involved in delivering and regulating the movement of these things through the body. And through that type of analysis, we might get to a more nuanced idea of what is Wei Qi and what is the role of Wei Qi in inflammation and immune response. After the initiation of the inflammatory response, the phagocytic white blood cells, the neutrophils, and macrophages migrate to the area. If pathogens are present, lymphocytes and antibodies invade the injured site, mounting an immune response. Leukocytosis is a characteristic sign of inflammation. Leukocytosis inducing factors released by injured cells promote a rapid release of neutrophils from the blood marrow. And the number of neutrophils in the bloodstream increases. 4 to 5-fold neutrophils usually migrate randomly, but are attracted to inflammatory chemicals termed chemotactic agents at the site of injury. Neutrophils are the most dominant monocyte in the body, accounting to like 40 to 50% of monocytes, and are upregulated due to injury or infection. Inflammation, the outpouring of fluid from blood into injured area, slows blood flow in the region. The slowing of the blood flows also leads to hypoxia, low blood oxygenation, which also contributes to the condition of the blood stasis condition. Neutrophils cling to the inner walls of the capillaries, then squeeze through the capillary walls, moving towards the site of inflammation, and within an hour, the neutrophils are active at the injury site. Within 8 to 12 hours after entering the tissues, they swell, develop large numbers of lysosomes, and become a macrophage. So then they start eating stuff. Macrophages facilitate the final disposal of cell debris as acute inflammation subsides. So this is, in a sense, an activity of the nonspecific immune system, where we recruit macrophages or neutrophils that transform to macrophages to non-specifically consume various debris that has occurred as a consequence of the inflammatory cascade, to clean up the area, and then cleaning up the area also down regulates the expression of, eliminates the expression of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, then leading to down regulation of the inflammatory cascade, and then the inflammation subsides. The vasoactive amines are pretty much the histamines. They're produced by mast cells. Mast cells are like the #1 producers of histamines. Basophils, platelets, vasoactive amines, they're stored and ready for release and act via the histamine receptors. H1 increases vascular permeability, contraction of smooth muscle, pulmonary vasoconstriction, chemokinesis of leukocytes, etc. H2 promotes gastric and mucus secretions, elevates cyclic AMP levels. H3 inhibits the synthesis of and release of histamines. And then there's the complement system that works in conjunction with everything else. It's made up to 20 proteins and their cleavage products, all of which are found in blood plasma. They kind of form up on the microbes and create little cleavage sites that ends up inducing lysis of the microbes. So the microbes get broken apart, or they shatter. They're lysed. This plays a role in inflammation. They increase vascular permeability and vasodilation, enhance leukocyte adhesion, enhance chemotaxis and activation, promote phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is like when macrophages eat stuff, they phagocytize it. They pretty much swallow it. They create like a vesicle inside themselves around the phagocytosed debris or cell or whatever they're eating. And then they go somewhere and get eaten themselves. There's two types of the complement system. There's the classic system, which is binding of an antibody antigen complex to a protein. And there's the alternate system, which is activated by bacterial endotoxins, complex polysaccharides, and aggregated globulins. And then there's the kinin system. These are highly active peptides found in the pancreas and a variety of other body tissues. They cause vasodilation of small arteries, constrict large arteries, and most veins, regardless of size. They increase capillary permeability, edema, bronchial and intestinal smooth muscle contractions. They're powerful pain producers and may have a role in the pathophysiology of migraines. The two primary kinins are calodin and bradykinin. And they're derived from precursors called kininogens. All right, and then now we can change gears. Then there's arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is the primary eicosanoid. Other eicosanoids include arachidonic acid is the precursor eicosanoid. Eicosanoids then are metabolized from arachidonic acid, and they include thromboxanes, prostaglandins, epoxygenases, leukotrienes, and lipoxins. They are local mediators of receptor-dependent effects, physiological processes, and pathologies, including bronchial asthma, inflammation, and coronary disease. Arachidonic acid is derived from animal fats or through conversion of linoleic acid from plants. Bound to cell membrane phospholipids and released by action of cellular phospholipases, which are activated by mechanical, chemical, and physical stimuli. So, I would like to thank Dr. Hoffman for all of that. And now we shall return to the discussion of Huangliang. So, prostaglandin, arachidonic acid then is converted to the various eicosanoids via the action of COX-1 and COX-2, cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. And at cyclooxygenase 1 and 2 is where the class of compounds known as NSAIDs works, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I thought this was an interesting way to deviate from me just reading slides. So if we look at like downstream from COX-1 and 2, where we have generation of prostaglandins, we have various other synthases which then induce the creation of prostaglandins and the thromboxanes and whatever PGI is. But they have different effects. Like prostaglandin E2 induces inflammation, hyperalgesia, like pain, induces vasodilation, natriuresis. Prostaglandin D2 is involved in allergic reactions. Prostaglandin F2 alpha is involved in contraction of the uterus. Thromboxanes are involved in vasoconstriction, platelet aggregation, bronchoconstriction, and yeah, prostaglandin I2 is involved in vasodilation, platelet aggregation. Interestingly, what is the most common NSAID? Ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is actually derived from aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, acetylsalicylic acid. Salicylic acid is derived from white willow bark, and white willow bark is Salix something or other. There's a bunch of different willow trees of different species. My local one is called Salix lemonii, lemons willow, but they have the salicylic acid, and so that was the original like painkiller NSAID, inflammation, anti-fever, febrifuge, that then caused some stomach upset, and so then the acetyl group is added to it to then create aspirin, and whatever the problem with aspirin is, then from aspirin we make some slight change, and then we create ibuprofen. Ibuprofen has problems because it's non-selective COX-1 and COX-2 antagonist, and so it tends to lead to the creation of peptic ulcers because the gut needs physiological inflammation, and if you completely arrest the inflammatory pathway, then you predispose to ulcer formation in the gut. So maybe we're interested in other kinds of COX-1 and COX-2 antagonists, and one of the ones that we find is berberine. Berberine inhibits COX-2 activity. It also inhibits COX-1 activity. I think it more effectively inhibits COX-2. I mean, it acts on inflammation through numerous pathways. It inhibits COX-2, but it also inhibits NF-kappa beta pathway, JAK2, STAT3, which also influence COX-2 expression. Does anybody know what the more challenging question, where I'm going to make a list and you'll immediately gain 2 points in your course score? What formula is marked by the presence of berberine and avodiamine? I had to stop sharing so I could see faces. Who knows the answer? No, don't do that. Don't start typing. You just need to know the answer. All right. No time. So what formula is Huang Lian and Wu Juyu? It's a crazy formula. Like
Virgin one.
yeah. Who said that? Who answered? Was that
Hi.
Lana? Awesome. Yeah, Swojin one. What a strange formula, right? You have like a really hot herb with the most cold herb. Frequently, there's also a powder like Huang Lian powder where you stir fry it in the juice of Wu Juyu, and then you sort of get like the Zhuojianwan construct theoretically just through the powder process on Huang Lian. Interesting, right? And so the major alkaloids in Huang Lian and Wu Juyu are berberine, and then avodiamine is in Wu Juyu. In this paper, I think also there's also this other crazy thing, dihydroavodiamine and potentially rutacarpin is also in Wu Juyu. Avodia rutacarpa I think that's actually what Wuji is, genus and species. Hence maybe why, maybe, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, yeah, that was good. That's fun. I think that's the first time I gave a quiz and somebody actually got an answer. Thanks for playing along there. I'm making a note. I'm making a note over here. um, yeah, so I mean, interestingly, one of the I'm like, what do I want to say about this? This is really interesting. Like Wuji or Zhuojin Wan is studied for gastritis and for peptic ulcers and its ability to treat gastritis, atrophic gastritis, gastric ulcers. And so it's interesting on one hand that NSAIDs may induce increased rate risk of peptic ulcers, but using like the combination of berberine and Huang of Wuju and Huanglian and Zhuojinwan can reduce stomach ulcer formation and gastritis and and uh and as a consequence, like the further study, because initially it's like, this formula is primarily used for acid reflux and then associated conditions like its ability to reduce H. pylori infection and to reduce ulcer formation. And then long-term ulceration and gastritis will then predispose to the development of gastric cancer. And so Zhuojin then becomes is studied as a treatment for gastric cancer. And you see kind of the thing I was talking about earlier, which was like the uncontrolled inflammation leading to the development of cancer. And in this case, something that treats the inflammation at its core is like an anti-inflammatory approach, treats the precursor syndromes like the gastritis or the ulcers, and it can also treat the cancer that develops out of that because it treats the conserved mechanism, which is why I'm always harping on about mechanism, right? Where if you see gastritis and peptic ulcer and gastric cancer as three different conditions, you can see them that way, but you can treat them as the same condition. They're all this unchecked inflammation condition. There's also the role of the H. pylori in inducing that inflammation. And obviously there's other factors as well, but so there's a reason why the inflammation doesn't stop. And in this case, in a lot of these cases, it's due to the H. pylori infection, but not every case. Anyway, so these have NSAID-like function. They're COX-2 inhibitors, Wujuyu and Huanglian, or berberine and avodiamine, and Zhuojinwan. It's something to think about when we're looking. I mean, this is like stuff, like I have this idea of like herbal substitutes for common pharmaceuticals. I teach a class called Herbal Substitutes for Common Pharmaceuticals. And so, I mean, like berberine, like Huanglian, primarily, like maybe its most overt role is its role as a substitute for antibiotics, certain antibiotics, azithromycin, streptomycin. And here we're kind of looking at it as from the context of its role of a COX-1, or in that case, a COX-2 inhibitor. Trying to draw direct correlations on one hand takes us back to the quality control stuff, where it's like when we prescribe an NSAID, you know exactly how many milligrams that you're prescribing. When we prescribe herbs, we don't really know. You're like, well, I think the active constituent is berberine, but how do I relate the concentration of berberine? Can I actually map those onto each other? This becomes challenging. And so, we can look at the pharmacopoeias and look what the pharmacopoeia requirements are for berberine or for palmitine. That's what's outlined for Coptis chinensis in the Hong Kong pharmacopoeia. And we see these limits, the limits for the lower concentrations. And, there's a study that looks at like essentially just in the Daodi regions in southwest China in Yunnan province, where we look at this plateau that's up 500 to 2,000 meters above sea level. where the Huang Lian is primarily growing along the edges of these meadows. And the concentrations are relatively conserved. If we look at the total alkaloids on the far right, we find that it's somewhere between 146 milligrams a gram to 175 milligrams a gram. So it's the variation is not more than like 15%. What is 10% of that is 15 and 20%, which is actually, it's like if it's less than like 50%, but the upside is all these things, the berberine here, the second column from the far right, berberine, where we have the berberine concentrations run from 80 to 66 to 80 milligrams a gram. The pharmacopoeia requirement is actually 40. This 4% is 40 milligrams a gram. So the concentration of these like Dowdy Huanglian is double the minute, like the highest on the high end is twice the pharmacopoeia minimums, and it's fairly stable. But then the question that emerges from this is the Huanglian that you're receiving grown in Yunnan? Is it from this small region on this Sichuan plateau? And it's hopeful. The more challenging problem is looking at the commercial berberine preparations, and you see what is the problem with like the dietary supplements and the dietary supplement industry. And I'm pretty sure if you took like a broad spectrum analysis of just Huanglian extracts across the market, you would find something similar. This is like a very rosy picture because you're just choosing Huanglian samples from like the best possible growing regions. This is probably more closer to what the market looks like in general, where half the products are quite far off, particularly some of these ones that are, whatever this company, Pura Organics, which is, they're claiming that it has X amount of, it has 500 milligrams a gram, and then it's like a third of that at the most. Thought that was just a fun way to go back through some of the things that we looked at in monograph 1, which was, like what is the growing region, what are the pharmacopoeia requirements, and then thinking about how do we take that information that we've looked at, like what are the concentrations that we see in the ideal growing regions versus what do we see on the product, in the products on the market, and then how do we map that efficacy into these ideas where we're looking at these type of pharmacological assays, and because you're doing a pharmacological assay, you always have a known concentration. So how relevant any study is to what you're doing in clinic is highly dependent upon controlling the concentration of the active constituents in the herbs that you use. This is why quality control is so important, and also it's kind of like the elephant in the room of herbal medicine practice is being blissfully ignorant of the entire subject. You're like, no, I just trust them. It's like trusting your government. Like or trusting a lot of things that probably don't have your best interest at heart. Like you think the herbal products industry has your best interest at heart. Is it's a capitalist industry. Their interest is in making a profit. Their primary interest is in making a profit. If they're making a profit, then they might be able to be concerned about the quality of the products, depending upon what they decide is the necessary amount of profit to make. So I thought this was an interesting article. It's looking at different herbs, and this is like they're looking at COX-1 and COX-2 pathways, but also lipid peroxidation pathways. But it was interesting that they kind of things fell into these different categories where the herbs that were effective at stopping lipid peroxidation and COX and icosanoid production by inhibiting COX-1 and COX-2 happened to be bitter cold herbs: Huang Bai, Huang Lian, Huang Qin, and Lian Chao. Whereas Huang Qi, Dong Gui, and Fu Ling only worked on the icosanoid production via inhibition of COX-1 and COX-2. And then there's another category where, things like Baijiu and Duo that are in the expel wind category that didn't really have antioxidant or inflammatory function. They seem to mediate their effect through coumarins or different pathways other than what they're looking at here. So this was just an assessment. Like if we look on the far right, whereas there's the red column under COX-1, and the redder it is, the more fully it inhibits COX-1. And so you see, like Angelica sinensis is a very good COX-1 inhibitor, and this is limited. It doesn't mean it doesn't inhibit COX-2. It's just whatever assays they were looking at, they accumulate the information this way. Angelica sinensis being Dongui, Angelica pubescens is Duo, Angelica dehurica is Baijiu. So they're all the Angelicas. And then there is Huangqi and Astragalus membranaceus. Number 5 is Baijiu, Atractyloides macrocephala. And then 7 is Coptis chinensis, Huanglian. 9 is Forsythia suspensa, Lian Chao. And then Baishao is 11, Peony lactiflora. 12 is Philodendron amaranth, Huang Bai. And then there's the relationship between Huang Bai, number 12, and Huang Lian, number 7, because Huang Bai chemistry is berberine dominant. Huang Bai is also just primarily a delivery system for berberine isoquinoid alkaloids. And so they have similar efficacy. And then Huang Qin, Scutellarium bicalensis, is also very effective. And so then they fall into these categories essentially where on the bottom left is bicalensis, is Huang Qin, Lian Chao, Huang Lian, and Huang Bai. And on this assessment, then Huang Qin would be the most effective at inhibiting icosanoid production and thereby inhibiting prostaglandin synthesis, and then inhibiting all those pathways that we looked at and with the prostaglandins and the thromboxanes. But also Huang Bai, Huang Lian, and Lian Chao fall in this category. Bitter cold medicinals can inhibit lipid peroxidation and COX-1 and COX-2 prostaglandin synthesis and inflammatory pathways. And then the sweet ones, Astragalus or Huangqi, Fu Ling, Dongui, they're zeroing out on the icosanoid production. They're on the x-axis. They're very low. Is that what that axis is? Anyway, on the vertical axis, they're low, so they inhibit most icosanoid production. But on the horizontal axis, they're not low, and so they don't inhibit the oxidative processes. So I guess that's not the right question. I mean, part of that, you come to this. Well, yeah, I guess that is the right question. Maybe that is the right question. Their conclusion was maybe if I wanted to specifically inhibit icosanoid production, COX-1 and COX-2, they're describing those as warm medicinals. And so maybe I look for more warm, and I have an end game on this whole thing. The warm and pungent COX inhibitors include Shengjiang and Zhanghuang and Guizhi and Rushang. And so this also goes back to the idea about inflammation, right? Like we think about inflammation, and you think about like the initial slide, which is like the whole ruber dollar color where it's like hot and it's red and it's painful. But not all inflammation isn't always hot. There can be inflammation without like the sensation of heat. And so we don't always, in our world where we do pattern differentiation, using cold herbs to treat inflammation is not always ideal because there can be inflammation in a cold pattern. And so we don't want to reflexively have to always use Da Huang or Huang Lian and Huang Qin and Huang Bai to treat inflammation. We have to be, because I mean, a lot of inflammatory patterns of inflammation require the use of even aconite. But in this case, we have Shengjiang. We're looking at Shengjiang, Zhanghuang, Guizhi, and Rushang. And I mean, obviously, Zhanghuang is turmeric, is curcuma longa. And then Rushang and Moyao. And so then we move into looking at this formula, this study, which is a look at what is known as the so shui. Okay. It's like a mouthful. Huo Luo Shaoling Dan. In Huo invigorating the collaterals, miraculously effective. Huo Luo Shaoling Dan. The miraculously effective pill. Huo Luo Shaoling Dan should be Danshen, Dongui, Rushang, Moyao. It's a really good formula for like cold like blood stasis, cold pain in the collaterals. Can be like a post-stroke formula, or a arthralgia formula, like a wind cold pain formula, wind cold invading the collaterals, causing pain. It can be like chronic B syndrome formula. So it requires it is an inflammatory pattern, but it's a cold inflammatory pattern, a cold blood stasis pattern, like a wind cold inducing contraction of the collaterals, causing impingement and impairment of blood flow, leading to blood stasis and pain. And so here they're, looking at the different active constituents. We have the boswellic acids that you find in Ruxiang and frankincense, and they inhibit COX-1. And then we have sanguinolide. What did I think that was? I don't remember what that's from right now. And then cryptotangenome from Danshen, and ruboric acid, and sanguinolide is from Chuanshang. Ruboric acid is from Qinzhou. This points to the fact that even though this research is about Huoluo Shaolingdan, which that formula, Huoluo Shaolingdan, is Danshen, Dongui, Rushang, Moyao. Their Huoluo Shaolingdan is like Chuanshang, Gansao, Sanqi, Danshen, Rushang, Qinzhou, at the very least. I think it's even more things. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Noto pterygium in Sism is not Sanqi, it's Changhuo. So this formula, they did like Dongui, Changhuo, Chuanshang, Gansao, probably Rushang and Moyao, and Qinzhou and some other stuff. So, yeah, they went big. I like Qinzhou is pretty sick. Qinzhou is Longdon Sao similar. Gentiana scabra, relative of Longdon Sao, Gentiana macrocephala. They have cool alkaloids in them. So yeah, well, this formula in its original form is dominantly, well, it's still pretty balanced anyway, mostly warm. So we have all these things about warm pungent herbs to treat pain to be COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors. Brings us back to the TCM version of ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is the original COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitor. Maybe it's not the original, but it's like ibuprofen is like the most commonly prescribed NSAID. And the NSAIDs are the most common class of drug to inhibit COX-1 and COX-2. So we went through like a long-winded story of starting with Huang Liang and looking at Zhuojin Wan and thinking about the role of COX-1 and COX-2 in gastritis and peptic ulcer and stomach cancer to maybe analyzing those two ideas. One is, that it's always damp heat and inflammation and heat versus then it's cold inflammation like you see in Huolo Xiaolingdan or even in things like Futsatong, Sinitong, Zhenwutong. And then you get to ibuprofen, and the flavor nature of ibuprofen is warm and pungent. And so if I was looking for herbal analogs to ibuprofen, I would look for warm and pungent COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors. And if we're looking at warm and pungent COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors, then that leads us to things like what? What does that lead us to? Who can tell me what
Asia.
Yeah. Yeah. Or
Oh, Shenzhen, Guizhou.
yeah. Or the Dongui and Rushang and Moyao. But yeah, very much Guizhou. And then you have that whole spectrum, right? Because then you can start looking at like warm and pungent COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors, and you can start placing them in the pattern that they belong in, right? I mean, if you want to think this way, we're like, well, I have COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors that are blood stasis COX-1, warm pungent COX-1 and COX-2, Rushang Moyao. When cold, COX-1 and COX-2 being like Guizhou Shengjiang, or like internal cold, COX-1 and COX-2 being like Fuzi and Ganjiang, or even Wujuyu. And so this is why our medicine's obviously superior to all others, I mean, obviously. That's why we're all here, because we're better than those other people that just throw drugs out there with no pattern differentiation. That's all we're gonna have time for today. So, your homework is to read the next 60 slides. And well, there's 30 more slides to this lecture. That are valuable, I mean, inflammation is infinitely complex. We would go into looking at radical oxidative species. Radical oxidative species are essentially internally generated pro-inflammatory factors that are generated through metabolic processes, are also generated through like ionizing radiation. Radical oxidative species are very problematic. They also cause damage to all kinds of other enzymes and proteins and to the DNA. And like I have mentioned before, the inflammation also causes the production of radical oxidative species. Radical oxidative species drive inflammation. They're two sides of the same coin. And so that's something to look at. That's the next part of the lecture. And then we get to like a little bit discussion of the immune system as in terms of like T helper 1, T helper 2, and interferon gamma and some pathways. It's likely that like coming up, when you go through the herbs that you're studying, a lot of them will work along inflammatory pathways, and so you'll be looking at some of this stuff and seeing like maybe your herb works through COX-1 and COX-2. Maybe the studies involve it looking at it in terms of the immune system, and then it would be some of its immunoregulatory issues. It's very common. I mean, the most kind of simpleton version on herbs is that they're antioxidants. And I mean, that's pretty much because, people don't want to understand herbs, so they just think an herb is similar to a vitamin. And a vitamin is an antioxidant. Like, well, this is the level of understanding I have. Yeah, but it's important to always keep in mind that something like berbering's role is so dynamic and so broad, you know. I mean, you're like, well, it's an antimicrobial, it's an antioxidant, it's anti-inflammatory, it's anti-carcinogenic, anti-atherosclerosis, anti-hyperlipidemia, anti-diabetic. Um, and then those are all just words because behind that are the pathways involved in those things. And the pathways then become these can be the same for different diseases or they can be different. It can be regulation of the inflammatory pathways. It can be regulation of cell cycle pathways like PI3K, AKT, mTOR. It can be regulation of metabolic pathways like regulation of the insulin or insulin growth factor, and then regulation of multiple pathways simultaneously is then what leads to regulation of a condition like atherosclerosis. And so berberine, in order to regulate multiple pathways that converge on a single pathology, in order for it to regulate multiple pathways, it has to affect like a dozen different targets. And this is how we get to the multi-target polypharmacy. That's what a single herb is. It has multiple constituents that target multiple targets that then have effect on multiple pathways to then affect multiple pathologies, you know? So part of like in the process of, you know, it's like you're on a choose your own adventure when you write your own, when you write part 2 of the monograph, you know? Like the most important thing that you could get out of it is learning more about what interests you, like what is applicable to you, you know, like in a conventional doctoral program, people would have specialties, you know, like you'd have a specialty because you'd have a thesis that you're writing, and then that would probably be reflected in like what is your specialty in your clinical practice. You know, and I tried to kind of promote that by like letting like choose your own herb. Ideally, that the herb that you chose is something that relates to something that you use clinically, you know. And so when you look at the research around the pharmacological actions of this herb, focus on the pharmacological actions that are important to the pathologies that you want to treat in clinic. You know, so what you're studying about this herb actually informs your practice, you know, because some of those herbs, there's just an infinite amount of subject, you know, you can study what it does all over the world, you know. Like for myself, you know, I say like I'm interested on oncology, so like I won't study necessarily fertility because those are like literally the antithesis of each other. You know what I'm saying? Like very, very materially, you know, like on one hand, there's a clump of cells, I want to kill it. You know what I mean? Like that's not fertility. That's very different than fertility, you know? So, you know, and so it's like, I would tend to look at oncology because that's my interest. Obviously I do work in fertility, but just to kind of be very crude about, I tend, you know, it's like if I'm focusing on this thing, there might be things that I obviously so I'm trying to minimize the horror of what you might witness when you start going through the monographs, because they'll in some monograph they'll cover the pharmacology on like every single part, you know, and what is required for you in the monograph is just to like you know get 10 points, you know, and to get 10 points you could probably just focus on one thing, you know, like the metabolic aspects of berberine, you know, of Huanglian. You know, I don't have to study all of the oncology stuff. I don't have to study all of the um atherosclerosis stuff. I mean, once you start seeing it, you're like, whoa, it all abuts each other. You know, it's like when you're in the metabolic stuff, it'll end up feeding into the anti-cancer function of it. The metabolic stuff will end up feeding into the anti-atherosclerotic function of it, you know. The metabolic stuff will feed into its effect against radical oxidative species and its function against inflammation, you know. And so that feeds back to my whole idea about um, dig a very deep hole and then make the hole wider because you'll start revealing what's adjacent to your primary domain of interest, you know, and then you'll have this expanding area of expertise. So as you work through the monograph part 2, focus on like a narrow tunnel. You know, don't go insane. Don't, I mean, obviously, or don't drive yourself insane, and don't make it any more extensive than it has to be. Any questions? It's just like, what the, what just happened? I feel like I got in a car accident. Week 8, the 8th car accident. Okay. Um, if there's no questions, I'll see everybody who's in the next class in the next class.
I do want to ask the Zojing one question.
Yes.
So I have a patient who has H. pylori and SIBO.
Mm-hmm.
So Zojing one like Huang Lian and Wu Zu Yu. That I was looking at the ratio, it's 6:1, right? The berberine to the warm ratio. And then I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to include the Huan Bai for the SIBO part. And is the idea because of the profile of the flavor, should I try to keep this 6:1 ratio? So berberine versus, I mean, I'm gonna have a Huan Bai and Huang Lian and Wu Zu Yu to offset the coldness. Would you think of, do you think it's a good idea to keep this 6:1 ratio when I add the Huan Bai?
I can't tell. I don't know. I mean, because you have to determine, I need to know what the pattern of the patient is. You know, like what is their pulse? What do they demonstrate? You know, because saying that it's H. pylori and SIBO, you can't do Chinese medicine with that information. You know.
Right. I think for me, I'm just paying attention to what you said earlier in the previous class. Like when you change the formula, ideally
Yeah,
think about the originator's profile of the fragrance instead of keep adding, you know.
yeah, but then I mean, the core question is Zoogen one the appropriate formula for that patient? If we
I
look at the
actually think
disease, and
so.
you do.
I do. And I'm just not agreeing. I'm not sure if I would keep this 6:1 ratio because it seems to me like my instinct is to add more of the warming, but I'm also trying to
What do their bowels do? What are their bowels like?
um, loose most of the time, but he's also trying all like a functional medicine with the doctors. So when the new medicine is introduced, he tend to have reactions to the bowel movement, but his original bowel movement is more like a cold, meaning like a loose stool.
And so, but you want to add Huang Bai, but you think it's cold.
Because of the SIBO, I just don't believe warming it up would get rid of
Yeah, I don't. I think that I mean, this is a good conversation that kind of points to this idea, right? We're like, yeah, I should use antimicrobial because there's a bacterial overgrowth, and then that tends toward wanting to use cold herbs. But if the presentation is like a deficient cold presentation, frequently, like in my clinical experience and working with the type of SIBO patients, the pattern is actually small intestine cold.
so another background is we also taking this lab class, right?
Yeah,
Where we are experimenting using a lab result in our
yeah,
clinic.
that's too bad.
And
No, I mean, yeah, okay.
so I haven't made up my mind, but I'm also trying to incorporate some of the lab test results. So I'm asking to bring the lab test results to the existing patients.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like in my experience, small intestine bacterial overgrowth does not indicate heat.
But
Yeah,
It's
perhaps because
usually
this
very
person,
cold. Sorry
yeah,
to interject. I've
no,
treated this and seen multiple cases of it, and I've had
yeah,
success using a formula called intestinal from more orthomolecular, and it's thyme oil, oregano oil, and clove oil. So
oh
all
boy.
very warming, herbs that also
Yeah.
are clearing the microbial heat. And I've seen people pulse it on and off, like with, I think I wrote this in one of our herb discussions, but we'll use that formula for a week and then change, depending on the patient, like if they have cold and heat, we'll pulse it the next week to like a berberine type of formula like you're talking about, but I've found that most people do really bad with berberine, like with the Wonglion, the cold draining herbs, because they are cold and deficient patients. And when you get them more cold and draining, you damage their chi more and their body has less of a chance to fight. So you're draining their immune system. So the thyme and the clove and the oregano is something you might want to think of. And then Cirex has a lab test for the leaky gut, and I think it might include SIBO.
All right,
So marker.
Hunter, let's not abuse I, because I mean, I like what you're saying, but I think I wants to do a canonical method.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm
Sorry for
interjecting
that.
to.
No, I
I'm
mean,
like,
thank you,
but wait,
Hunter.
but wait, but wait. Let's take that idea, because
Yeah,
like, and look at it in terms of flavor and nature, like what Hunter was saying, where it's like it's oregano, it's thyme, it's whatever the third one was, clove, and they're all warm and pungent, and they're antimicrobial. And so it's like, do we have a canonical approach that mimics that kind of strategy?
yes.
And I mean, in some sense, I mean, it also is pointing to um the Wu Mei one, are not, I mean, I'm saying Wu Mei one, that's what's in my head. Of Zhuojin one and being 6 to 1, and like I think me and Hunter are on the side of like no, it shouldn't be 6 to 1, but it shouldn't be more cold. Actually, it should be the opposite direction. It should, instead of going from like 6 to 1 to 9 to 1 to 12 to 1, it should be heading back towards something where it would be more on the Wu Juyu side, less on the Hongliang side,
Right.
and I think this is something to consider, because when you start working through that way, you end up with something like a Wume one, probably. I think that's kind of where this thing ends
Yeah,
up
Wume
at.
one worked for a while, but he didn't he started feeling not well, so we stopped it. It's a good idea to visit again.
Yeah. I mean, what happened was, did he get external cold invasion or something, or what was the not wellness
Yeah,
that he
because he
felt?
have a little kids.
Oh, okay,
He
yeah, yeah,
constantly get this external
yeah,
invasion,
yeah,
and um, I
yeah,
I think the issue is he does have a stomach heat because of the I'm guessing H. pylori, but so it
yeah,
kind of goes back and forth. So what Hunter was saying of like like the warm herb followed by the berberine, that
yeah.
be something that I should consider.
I mean, this is sort of like the hallmark of a Joy-in condition, where it is the cold heat complex mixed together, and then you
Mm-hmm.
end up like bouncing from one side to the other, unless you're a god, and none of, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know
Yeah,
any. It's just like, unless you do it perfectly all the time, and then you're never off the mark a little. But typically, it's all a little off the mark, and so you end up bouncing around from hot to cold to hot to cold.
yeah.
And I mean, that I think is indicative of it being a Julian condition, and that
Okay.
it is probably, I mean, there could potentially be manifestation that you could describe that way as stomach heat and small intestine cold,
Okay.
or it can just be like the flaring of the ministerial fire due to insufficiency of blood, and how this is manifesting at one time or another in conjunction with. And then how does that then ramify into, like, what are the deficiencies of his immune system, and why it allows for the accumulation of these microbes, the bacteria,
Right.
because in our
I
medicine, there's always that struggle, where it's like, if
Yeah,
you just fix somebody's bodily function, then the body itself fixes the problem with the microbes,
right.
and so we've already like given up on Chinese medicine when we start using an antibiotic dominant approach.
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, there is
Right.
like, we want to in an acute phase, you see the medicine that way. It's like in an acute phase, you can attack the pathogen, but
Uh-huh.
but as we rectify and eliminate evil, we need to move into the point where we're supporting the body itself to eliminate the pathogen so that it becomes impervious to the occupation of the pathogen, and
Yeah,
so
I certainly
um
want to get there.
but yeah, and so I mean, I don't want to cut off Hunter because she has great stuff to say, but I also think that there is, because I'm all about, I've had thyme oil has been a miracle worker for me in the past, as has oregano oil. But I mean, I also, from looking at I's case studies, I'm like, I see I tends to, you have a particular style of practice which may not involve using those methods. And so we might want to look just specifically at the canonical method and trying to see it through the lens of using Shanghai Zabinglun formulas to try to regulate this thing. And
Yeah,
I would
thank you
be
for that.
careful about going too cold. You know what I mean? I would be careful about, and so going back to the core question of like, should I be mindful of the 6-to-1 when I add more? If I'm, if you're going to add more Huang Bai, do you need to add more warm stuff? Or I mean, I would say if you're going to add more Huang Bai, you should add more warm stuff, which brings you back to Wu Mei Wan, where you're like,
Right.
now I'm like,
Yeah,
well, what
that's
warm
right.
stuff should I order? I'm like, well, then yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, let me take a break, and I'll see you guys in the next class. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.